There is a darkness that belongs specifically to that decade, a shadow that fell across the American landscape with the particular weight of something long overdue. It was not the darkness of ignorance, though ignorance played its part. It was not the darkness of poverty alone, though poverty was always present, always lurking at the edges of the frame. It was something stranger, something more difficult to name, a collective unease that settled over the country like a fog that no morning could quite burn away. The 1980s in America were, by almost any surface measurement, a time of expansion and optimism and fluorescent abundance. The malls were full. The television sets were large and glowing. The president smiled with the practiced ease of a man who had spent a lifetime performing reassurance. And yet beneath all of it, in the basements and the back rooms and the quiet desperation of ordinary lives, something was very wrong. To understand the horror of that era, you must first understand the landscape that produced it. America in 1980 was a nation emerging from a decade of extraordinary trauma, Vietnam still bleeding into the national consciousness like a wound that refused to close, Watergate having shattered whatever remained of civic faith, the oil shocks and the hostage crises, and the general atmosphere of a country that had somehow lost its way in its own mythology. And into this raw, confused, still tender moment, a new vision of America was offered. It was a vision of mourning, of redemption, of restoration. It asked the country to feel good about itself again, to stop examining the difficult questions, to turn away from the mirror and simply move forward with confidence into a gleaming future. Many people accepted this offer gratefully, perhaps too gratefully, because what happens when a culture decides, collectively, to stop looking at its own shadows? What accumulates in the dark places of a society that has chosen optimism as both political philosophy and psychological survival strategy? The answer, if you are willing to look, is everywhere in the record of those years. It is in the statistics that were ignored, the communities that were abandoned, the crises that were dismissed or denied or actively concealed. The horror of the 1980s was not primarily the horror of monsters. It was the horror of what ordinary people, ordinary institutions, ordinary systems are capable of when they convince themselves that everything is fine. Consider the cities. By 1980, many of America's great urban centers had been hollowing out for years, the consequence of deliberate policy decisions that had redirected resources and investment away from dense, older communities and toward the expanding suburbs that were understood to represent the proper American future. But the 1980s accelerated this process with a particular ferocity. Federal funding for cities was cut, social services were reduced, mental health institutions were emptied in the name of community-based care, a vision of compassionate treatment that never received the funding to become reality. And so, thousands upon thousands of people with severe mental illness found themselves on the streets of cities that were simultaneously withdrawing the resources that might have helped them. They became part of the landscape of urban America, visible, present, impossible to ignore and yet systematically ignored. A daily confrontation with the consequences of policy choices that the political language of the moment was not equipped to honestly describe. New York City was a particular theater of this drama. The city that had nearly been declared dead in the previous decade, that had stared into the fiscal abyss and been pulled back by emergency measures and considerable suffering among its working population, now found itself navigating a strange, double existence. In certain neighborhoods, particularly in Manhattan, money was returning with a force that would have seemed impossible just years before. Young professionals with briefcases and cocaine habits were claiming territory, renovating brownstones, discovering the pleasures of urban life in ways that required them not to look too carefully at what their pleasure was displacing. And in the South Bronx, in Harlem, in sections of Brooklyn and Queens, entire communities were burning. Sometimes literally, the arson fires of landlords seeking insurance payments on buildings they could no longer rent, the neighborhood block associations, watching their streets transform into something that no language of decline quite adequately described. It was in this period that the crack epidemic was born. Not spontaneously, not mysteriously, but through a convergence of circumstances so systematic that some have argued, with considerable documentary evidence, that the convergence was not entirely accidental. Cocaine had been the drug of the privileged through much of the 1970s, glamorous and expensive, and associated with a certain kind of success. But by the early 1980s, a simpler, cheaper, smokable form had begun to appear in the urban markets of Los Angeles and New York and Miami. Crack cocaine arrived in communities that had already been stripped of employment, of investment, of functional institutions, of hope. It arrived with the efficiency of something perfectly designed for its environment, and it spread with a speed that overwhelmed whatever remained of the social fabric in the neighborhoods it entered. The response of the federal government to the crack epidemic is one of the most revealing chapters in the horror story of the decade. Rather than treating the crisis as the public health emergency that it clearly was, the administration chose a language of moral failure and personal responsibility. The addicted were not sick people in need of treatment. They were criminals in need of punishment. And so the prison population of the United States, which had remained relatively stable for much of the preceding century, began to climb. It would not stop climbing for decades. The mandatory minimum sentencing laws, the disparity in sentencing between crack cocaine and powder cocaine, a disparity that fell with almost mathematical precision along racial lines, the militarization of domestic policing. All of this was constructed in the 1980s, built brick by deliberate brick into an architecture of mass incarceration that would become one of the defining and most destructive features of American life. And still, the official story was one of strength and renewal. The economy was growing, at least in certain sectors and for certain people. The stock market was rising with a fervor that would have seemed hallucinatory to observers from an earlier era. The leveraged buyout and the hostile takeover and the junk bond were being elevated to the status of almost heroic activities, the men who practiced them celebrated in magazines and television programs as exemplars of the American spirit. There was a particular kind of pornography in the financial culture of the decade, an obsessive, almost sexual fascination with the display and acquisition of wealth, a willingness to treat the evisceration of living companies, the destruction of jobs and communities, as simply the way things work, the cold logic of the market expressed without apology or sentiment. The horror of this financial culture was not invisible. It was narrated in real time by the communities that bore its consequences. The steel towns of Pennsylvania and Ohio, the automotive communities of Michigan, the textile towns of the South. These places watched their central industries collapse not through any failure of effort or skill on the part of their workers, but through a combination of global economic shifts and deliberate corporate decisions that were celebrated in the financial press as examples of rational management. The people who had built their lives around these industries, who had raised families and built communities, and understood their labor as connected to something larger than themselves. These people were being told, in the polite language of economic transformation, that they were obsolete. The human cost of this obsolescence was incalculable and largely uncounted. But perhaps no horror of the 1980s was more complete, more devastating, more thoroughly revealing of the moral architecture of the era than the AIDS crisis. To understand what happened requires a willingness to sit with the full weight of the facts, which are these. A deadly virus began killing people in the United States in the early 1980s. It was identified. It was studied. And for years during which tens of thousands of people died, the federal government of the most powerful nation in the history of the world did essentially nothing. Not because the crisis was invisible, not because the science was unclear, but because the people who were dying first and most visibly were gay men, and the administration in Washington had decided, without quite saying so, that these were not people whose deaths required urgent national response. The silence from the White House during those years was not passive. It was active. It was a choice, made repeatedly, to look away from a burning house. The president did not publicly address AIDS for years. His press secretary joked about it. His administration cut funding for public health research and education. And in the absence of governmental response, the gay community of America, already targeted by social hostility, already living in various degrees of concealment and danger, was left to organize its own response to a medical catastrophe. The organizations that emerged from this abandonment, the activists who transformed grief and rage into political action, the doctors and nurses and friends and lovers who cared for the dying in the absence of adequate institutional support, these people demonstrated something extraordinary about human capacity under the most terrible pressure. But they should never have been forced to demonstrate it. The horror was not only in the virus. The horror was in the decision, made at the highest levels of American power, that certain lives did not matter enough to save. By the middle of the decade, America was also living through a terror of a different kind, one that operated in the intimate spaces of family and childhood, and that revealed, with particular clarity, how a culture's fears can become distorted into something that creates its own destruction. The Satanic Panic, as it would later be called, began in 1983 with accusations made against workers at the McMartin preschool in Manhattan Beach, California. A mother, later found to be suffering from severe mental illness, accused a worker of abusing her son. The accusation spread. Children were interviewed by therapists using techniques that are now understood to have been deeply suggestive and deeply unreliable. Techniques that asked leading questions, that rewarded certain answers, that shaped the memories of young children into narratives that bore the mark of adult anxiety more than anything that had actually occurred. What followed was one of the longest and most expensive criminal trials in American history, ending in acquittals after years of destroyed lives and reputations and the imprisonment of people who were almost certainly innocent. But the McMartin case was only the most prominent node in a vast network of accusations that spread across the country through the middle years of the decade, touching preschools and daycare centers and churches and communities in virtually every state. The accusations followed a remarkably consistent pattern, involving satanic rituals, underground tunnels, impossible numbers of abusers and victims, acts so extreme and so logistically improbable that their very extremity should have prompted skepticism. Instead, in many communities, the extremity of the accusations seemed only to confirm their reality. How could anyone invent such things? Surely only something that had actually happened could be so terrible. The answer, which took years of hindsight to fully understand, is that human beings under conditions of fear and suggestibility are capable of constructing and genuinely believing almost anything. The therapists and social workers and prosecutors who drove these prosecutions were not, for the most part, cynical manipulators. They were people who had convinced themselves that they were protecting children from unimaginable evil. And in their certainty, they became the perpetrators of genuine injustice on a remarkable scale. The horror of the Satanic Panic was not the horror of actual Satanists. It was the horror of what righteous certainty can do in the absence of critical thought. The cultural context for this panic was not accidental. The 1980s were a decade of intense anxiety about children, about the family, about what was happening to American innocence in a world that seemed to have become suddenly and inexplicably threatening. Some of this anxiety was rooted in real phenomena. The milk carton children, the missing child crisis, the stranger danger campaigns that filled the decade with a particular kind of low-level dread. These were responses to genuine tragedies, genuine crimes, though the statistical reality of child abduction by strangers was far less common than the cultural atmosphere suggested. The anxiety exceeded its object, which is to say that the fear became larger than the actual threat, and in becoming larger, it required larger explanations and larger villains. It was in this atmosphere of ambient dread that the American horror film found its greatest commercial success, and perhaps its deepest cultural resonance. The genre had always served as a container for social anxiety, a place where the fears that polite culture refused to openly acknowledge could be dramatized and, at least temporarily, contained. But in the 1980s, the horror film became something of a national obsession, with a productivity and a popularity that reflected the extraordinary levels of unprocessed anxiety accumulating in the culture. Freddy Krueger invaded the dreams of children and teenagers, appropriate enough, given the dreams were precisely the territory that the decade's actual terrors were occupying. Jason Voorhees returned, again and again, unkillable and implacable, from a lake that represented the corrupted pastoral, the American wilderness turned predatory. Michael Myers moved through the suburban landscapes of Middle America with the blank purposefulness of something that could not be reasoned with, or appealed to, or understood. These figures were not accidental. They were the monsters that the decade needed, embodiments of the irrational, the uncontrollable, the violence that lurked beneath the ordered surface of American life. They were expressions of a culture's knowledge that something was deeply wrong, translated into the safe distance of fiction. And the audiences who lined up around the block to see them, who screamed and laughed and screamed again, were participating in a ritual of acknowledgement that the official culture was not providing. Something is out there in the dark. Something is coming for you. Something that cannot be stopped by optimism or productivity or the correct political attitude. Beyond the movie theaters, the horror was unfolding in ways that required no special effects. The serial killer became, in the 1980s, a figure of almost mythological cultural prominence. Ted Bundy, who had committed his crimes in the 1970s, was tried and executed in 1989, his media coverage reaching levels that would have seemed obscene to any earlier generation. John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, the Night Stalker, the Green River Killer. The list of names that accumulated through the decade constituted a kind of dark catalog of American pathology. The FBI's behavioral science unit at Quantico was developing the profiling techniques that would become both legitimate investigative tools and the basis for an enormous cultural mythology about the nature of evil and the people who practiced it. What the coverage of serial killers in the 1980s revealed, at least in part, was a culture hungry for comprehensible monsters. The larger horrors of the decade, the structural violence of poverty and discrimination, the slow catastrophe of the AIDS crisis, the destruction of communities through economic policy, these were too diffuse, too systemic, too implicating of the society as a whole to serve as satisfying objects of fear and outrage. But the serial killer was individual, comprehensible in his monstrousness, prosecutable, punishable. He could be caught. He could be understood, at least partially, by the brilliant investigators who tracked him. He could be executed. And then it would be over. The individual horror could be contained and concluded in ways that the systemic horror could not. Meanwhile, in the evangelical churches and the fundamentalist communities that were experiencing their own extraordinary expansion in this period, a different kind of horror story was being narrated. The prosperity gospel, which was becoming increasingly mainstream through the decade, told a story in which material success was evidence of divine favor, and poverty was at least implicitly evidence of spiritual failure. This was not, of course, the traditional Christian understanding of wealth and poverty. It was something considerably darker, a theology of success that provided spiritual justification for the systematic withdrawal of compassion from those who were suffering. If the poor were poor because of their own moral failures or spiritual deficiencies, then there was no particular obligation to address the structural conditions that produced poverty. The obligation was to pray for their souls, perhaps, but not necessarily to feed their bodies or house their families, or provide their children with decent schools. The televangelists of the era preached this gospel from television studios that resembled theme parks, surrounded by the theatrical trappings of prosperity, the expensive suits, the elaborate stage sets, the appeals for donations that funded increasingly baroque expressions of personal luxury. And when these same preachers fell, as several of them did in spectacular fashion, the sexual scandals, the financial frauds, the revelations of hypocrisy so complete as to constitute almost a parody of itself, the falls were experienced as entertainment rather than tragedy. Because the culture had already understood, on some level, that the prosperity gospel was a performance. The horror was not in the discovery of the hypocrisy. The horror was in how many people had needed to believe in it. The decade was also, it is important to remember, the decade of nuclear fear. For all the brightness of the official optimism, for all the flags and the morning imagery and the rhetoric of strength, ordinary Americans were living with the genuine and entirely rational understanding that they existed at the mercy of a weapons arsenal capable of destroying human civilization many times over. The Cold War had intensified in the early 1980s, and there were moments, particularly in 1983, which by some accounts came closer to actual nuclear exchange than any period since the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the fear was not abstract but immediate. The television movie The Day After aired in November 1983 to an audience of over 100 million people, depicting in unsparing detail the aftermath of nuclear strikes on American cities, and the national conversation that followed was a rare moment of public acknowledgement that the terror was real, that the stakes were genuine, that all of the prosperity and the optimism and the cultural vitality of the decade existed under a shadow that could extinguish it without warning. This particular fear occupied a strange position in the psychology of the era. It was simultaneously acknowledged and suppressed, real and unmentionable, too enormous to contemplate and too enormous to ignore. People built fallout shelters and then stopped talking about them. They watched films about nuclear war and then resumed their ordinary lives. The cognitive dissonance required to function normally while knowing what you knew about the world of the early 1980s was remarkable, and it contributed to a general atmosphere of unreality, the sense that the bright surfaces of the decade were floating above an abyss that no one was quite willing to name. The children who grew up in this decade absorbed all of it. They absorbed it through the culture they consumed, the horror films and the heavy metal music and the nuclear anxiety and the missing children campaigns and the drug war messaging and the AIDS crisis that their teachers and parents struggled to explain. They absorbed it through the communities they lived in, whether those communities were being devastated by economic abandonment or by the crack epidemic, or by the quiet desperation of families trying to maintain respectability while the world they had expected was being dismantled around them. They absorbed it through the particular texture of everyday life in a decade that was simultaneously telling them they lived in the greatest country on earth and showing them something considerably more complicated. The suburban landscape, which was the primary environment of American childhood in the 1980s, had its own particular atmosphere of unease. The subdivisions spread outward from the cities into what had recently been farmland, creating communities of remarkable physical sameness. The ranch houses and the split levels and the cul-de-sacs and the strip malls, the geography of a certain kind of American aspiration that had achieved its physical form and was not entirely sure what to do with it. The children who moved through these landscapes on their bicycles, who played in the half-constructed houses at the edges of the developing subdivisions, who gathered in the basements of friends and watched forbidden movies on VHS tapes while parents were at work, these children understood something that the adult world was reluctant to articulate, that the safety of the suburb was, in important ways, a fiction, because the violence was there too, even in the quiet streets with the carefully maintained lawns. It was in the domestic spaces behind the closed doors, in the rates of child abuse and domestic violence that the decade's researchers were beginning to document with new rigor. It was in the suicides, which were rising among adolescents in ways that prompted genuine alarm among mental health professionals who were struggling to understand what was happening to the children of prosperity. It was in the schoolyard drug use and the teenage pregnancies and the runaway rates and all the other evidence that underneath the cheerful surfaces of the American suburb, considerable suffering was occurring that the cultural mythology of the moment was not designed to acknowledge. The decade's relationship with its own women was a particularly complex and painful chapter in the larger story. The feminist movement of the previous decade had achieved real gains, opening professional doors and legal protections that had not previously existed, shifting at least the public language of gender relations in significant ways. But the 1980s saw a sustained and sophisticated backlash against these gains, sometimes explicitly political, sometimes cultural, sometimes simply the accumulated weight of a society that had not yet honestly reckoned with what equality would actually require. The working mother became simultaneously celebrated as a symbol of modern possibility and blamed for nearly every social ill of the decade. The latchkey children, the daycare crises, the breakdown of the family, the drug use, even the Satanic Panic could be traced, in some of the period's cultural logic, to the absence of mothers who should have been home. The women who navigated the professional world of the 1980s did so in a landscape of remarkable hostility that was often dressed in the language of opportunity. They were told they could have it all, the career and the family and the personal fulfillment, without being told honestly what the actual conditions of having it all consisted of, which were exhaustion and compromise and a double standard of judgment that applied different measures of success and failure to women than to their male colleagues. The horror here was not dramatic. It was the horror of 1,000 daily small violences, 1,000 acts of dismissal and condescension and professional sabotage that accumulated over years into something that shaped and constrained, and sometimes broke, the lives of women who had been promised something different. And in the intimate spaces where abuse occurred, in the marriages and the families and the relationships that the cultural mythology of the decade required to appear functional, the women who were being harmed had very little recourse. The domestic violence shelters were underfunded, the legal protections were inadequate. The cultural presumption was still, in many communities, that what happened in a marriage was private, that a certain level of male violence was simply part of the landscape of intimate life, that women who left, or complained, or sought help were in some way responsible for the disruption their complaints caused. The horror was systemic and intimate simultaneously, which is perhaps the most difficult kind to see clearly when you are living inside it. The horror of the 1980s, understood fully, was also a racial horror, as American racial horror has always been and continues to be. The decade saw a dramatic increase in hate crimes, in the visibility and activity of white supremacist organizations, in the daily violence that Black and Hispanic and Asian Americans experienced in communities across the country. Howard Beach, Bensonhurst, the Central Park Five, 5 young men of color falsely convicted of a brutal crime they did not commit, railroaded by a criminal justice system and a media environment in which their guilt was presumed before any evidence was examined. The full-page advertisements taken out by a New York real estate developer calling for their execution. The years they spent in prison before DNA evidence exonerated them. The willingness of that developer, decades later, to continue to assert their guilt. These were not anomalies. They were expressions of something structural, something embedded deep in the architecture of American institutions. The understanding, acted upon in courtrooms and police precincts and hiring offices and mortgage banks across the country, that the lives of Black Americans and other Americans of color were worth less, required less protection, were more presumptively suspect, more disposable, more available for exploitation. The horror of American racism was not new in the 1980s, but the decade's particular combination of official optimism and deliberate policy cruelty gave it a particular flavor, a specific texture of abandonment that was experienced by the communities who bore its weight as something like being told, by the full authority of the state, that you simply did not count. As the decade drew toward its close, the consequences of its choices began to accumulate into a weight that could no longer be entirely ignored. The savings and loan crisis, in which the deregulation of the financial industry had created the conditions for massive fraud and incompetence on a scale that would cost American taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars, was beginning to emerge from the shadow. The AIDS death toll was climbing past numbers that demanded acknowledgement, even from those who had spent years looking away. The crack epidemic had generated a prison population explosion that was straining the systems of states and counties across the country, while doing nothing to address the conditions that had produced the epidemic in the first place. The children of the decade's economic abandonment were growing up in communities so damaged by disinvestment and violence and addiction that the word community itself was beginning to seem inadequate to describe what remained. And yet the official narrative was still, largely, one of victory. The Cold War was ending. The Berlin Wall was coming down. The evil empire, as it had been called with characteristic theatrical simplicity, was dissolving. These were real events of genuine historical significance. The reduction in the nuclear threat was a legitimate cause for relief. But the triumphalism with which the decade's conclusion was narrated, the story of capitalism's decisive victory over its great ideological competitor, the end of history, as one influential account put it. This triumphalism made it even more difficult to honestly examine what the decade had cost, what it had done, who it had hurt, and how deeply. Because the accounting was needed, it is still needed. The horrors of the 1980s did not end with the decade. They had been built into the foundation of what came after, encoded in the policies and the institutions, and the cultural assumptions that were laid down in those years, and that continue to shape American life in ways both visible and invisible. The mass incarceration system that was constructed in that decade is still operating. The inequality that was accelerated in that decade has only deepened. The communities that were abandoned in that decade have, in many cases, never recovered. The AIDS crisis left scars on a generation of gay men that are still present in the bodies and the memories of those who survived. The children who were falsely accused, and the families that were destroyed in the Satanic Panic, have never received full acknowledgement of what was done to them. Horror, in the most serious sense of the word, is not about monsters. It is about the recognition of what human beings are capable of, the cruelty that ordinary systems and ordinary people can produce and sustain and deny. It is about the gap between what a culture tells itself it is and what the evidence of its actual behavior demonstrates. The 1980s in America were a horror story in this most serious sense. A decade in which the gap between the self-image and the reality was enormous, in which the official narration of mourning and strength and renewal required an extraordinary amount of looking away, in which the people who were least powerful were required to bear the greatest costs of choices made by people who would never bear any cost at all. There is a temptation, looking back, to explain this too quickly, to reach for the comfortable conclusion that things have changed, that the lessons were learned, that the horrors described here belong to a past that has been honestly examined and genuinely left behind. This temptation should be resisted, not because progress is impossible. Progress is possible, and has in some domains occurred, but because the work of understanding what happened, of tracing the actual consequences of the choices made in those years, of honoring the full reality of lives that were damaged or destroyed by the policies and the indifference and the active cruelty of the decade. This work is not finished. It may, in fact, have barely begun. What we owe the dead and the living who carry the marks of those years in their bodies and their communities is honesty. Not the honesty of accusation alone, but the harder honesty of genuine comprehension. The willingness to look at what actually happened, in all its complexity and its pain, and to say, this is what we were, this is what we did, this is what it cost. The darkness of the 1980s is not a relic. It is a foundation, and foundations matter, because everything built upon them carries, whether we acknowledge it or not, the weight of what they are made of. The fog has not entirely lifted. In certain lights, at certain moments, you can still see it, drifting through the streets of cities that were never allowed to heal, settling over the communities that were told they did not matter, lying low across the landscapes of a country that has not yet finished its reckoning with a decade of ordinary, systematic, spectacular, and deeply American horror. The decade ended. The horrors did not. And the work of seeing them clearly, of refusing the comfortable blindness that the era itself modeled and celebrated, is the minimum that honesty requires of us, now, in whatever light we are currently calling morning.